Ready? Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Michael Schearer, the Pres 98, and I am not Johnny Long. He's over there. But sometimes you get put up against a speaker like Johnny Long, and you figure, well, what do you do about that? Well, you don't do anything about that, and you be absolutely happy that 40 or so of you decided to come here instead of there. So thank you. You could. You could, and that would suck, but you know. So I'm going to talk about political activism in the hacker community, and I'll be explicit that I'm talking about the United States here. So some of this would apply outside of the country, but the stuff I'm going to talk about is purpose to the United States. So I'm going to just post this quote up here and let you stew on it, and then eventually we'll get to talking about it more in specifics. But this is a quote that I heard recently, and we will get to that. So under certain circumstances, DDoS, or Distributed Denial of Service, is protected political speech and should be afforded First Amendment protection. So you can think about whether or not you agree with that or not, and I'll get to we'll get to that specifically. So this is who I am. Lead Associate, Senior Penetration Tester at Booz Allen. Some of you know that I worked at Booz Allen previously, and I left to go out on my own. I decided to go back to school, so I'm a law student now at the University of the District of Columbia. And I didn't want to worry about running my own business and going to school at the same time, so I went back to Booz Allen. So I was also a Navy veteran and did a whole bunch of stuff in Iraq. So this is a slide that I always include, a title slide that I always include in my talks. And so speakers will often tell you why you should listen to them, because they're an expert, because, you know, whatever. I always like to say why you should be skeptical of the things I say, right? So first of all, I'm not a lawyer, but yet. So that's like the new thing now. You all see A-I-A-N-A-L all the time. Like, I'm not a lawyer, but now with the Y, that's my thing. I made that. So this presentation is both unintentionally and intentionally, you know, sort of biased by my own beliefs. So some stuff I intentionally put in here to be provocative or whatever, and some of it is just the way I am, and I may not even realize that I did it, so realize that. This is also by far the most political presentation I've given in all of my talks, and I'm very closer? Sure. So I'm very, you know, careful about talking about politics because, you know, as we'll get to, this community is not always very political, and it's, you know, it's very easy to like turn half the people off because what you say you don't necessarily agree with. So it's a political presentation, but it's not about politics itself. So I don't care, you're Republican, Democrat, Green Party, whatever, it doesn't matter. And where you stand on the issues really doesn't matter for the sake of this presentation. So this presentation is more about process than results. So we'll talk about the process, and you may get to a different result than I do, and that's fine. So I say, just don't take my word for it. Figure it out on your own. This is just kind of throwing my stuff out there. So let's try to define a few things before we move on. Politics, well, what is it? So I don't know. There's public policy issues, who knows? Let me tell you, like, sort of my default position. So I will refer to some political issues in this presentation, and I refer to them not to, you know, so later on I'm going to talk like for about 30 seconds about Obamacare. And it's not going to be because I'm for or against it, but I want to use it as an example to show what I'm talking about. So most of you will know that I'm pretty conservative. I've been a Republican my entire life. In the past 5 years, I've become considerably more libertarian, and I would register as a libertarian in Maryland, but they don't let you register as a libertarian in Maryland, so I can't. So let me frame it in this way. Regardless of the outcome of the issue, the way I'm going to look at an issue for this presentation is more freedom is almost always better to less freedom. Okay, so that's where we're going to start from. Activism, hacktivism. So for the purposes of this presentation only, just so we're clear. When I say activism, I'm referring to acts that would otherwise be considered legal acts. So more or less working within the system. And when I say hacktivism, I want to define that very narrowly to be illegal hacktivism, right? So acts that you could get arrested for. Like, for example, DDoS. You could get arrested for DDoS. Whether or not you think it's free speech or not, you could get arrested for it. So for the purposes of this presentation, hacktivism, we're define it very narrowly to be an illegal act. So here's some other issues just to stew over for the purposes of this. Where's the line between legal and illegal? And this is where we get into some of these issues. Should it move, or does it really matter? Who knows? Do the ends justify the means? So if we want to get from A to B, does it matter how we get there, right? Or does it not matter? Does the process by which we get from A to B matter? So every decision has costs and benefits, and we need to weigh them. If the costs outweigh the benefits, then maybe that's not the way to do it. Okay. So this is how I see sort of the status quo of the hacker community. You can feel free to disagree. I think the hacker community, in large part, is sort of apolitical. We don't talk about politics a lot. There's some exceptions. How many of you hope? I mean, it's pretty political, right? There might be other places. And the only time that we really seem to get fired up is, sort of the SOPA PIPA debate of last year, where like the whole community sort of rose up and Google and Wikipedia and everyone else sort of said no, so that was, we coalesce around those issues, maybe some a little bit less for like net neutrality. But other than those sort of technical issues, we just sort of say it's there. We don't really want to get into politics because we don't want to be divisive, that sort of thing. Although I think things are starting to change a little bit. So in the past couple of years, we've seen some of these issues, privacy issues, net neutrality, that sort of thing. And these issues are starting to invade the things that we talk about all the time. The InfoSec disclosure debate is an old debate, really. We've been talking about that forever. But we'll talk about in a little bit how that sort of disclosure debate has now moved into other areas, and it's new to them. So is this good or bad? I don't know if it's good or bad, but I think it's happening, so I think we ought to think about it. So this is sort of where I want to go. It's my opinion. I think it's inevitable that we're going in this direction, so I think we need to figure out a way to look at these issues and not say, well, the Republicans think this, so that's my position, or the Democrats think this, so that's my position. Let's look at it a little bit differently and figure out. So what I'm asking of you and me, groups like the EFF are sort of already doing this. If you go to the EFF and you go to their issues, they talk about a lot more stuff than we often hear about. They're already sort of out there in the trenches doing a lot of stuff. So I'm saying, let's embrace those things and push that agenda along. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them on everything. I don't think this is really a radical change, although I think it is sort of I think we have a sort of a mental block to getting involved in this sort of thing. And then what are the costs and benefits of doing that? If we start taking positions on issues, then we are going to turn people off to that sort of thing. Okay, let's talk about some individual issues. This is my favorite quote. So I talked about, do the ends justify the means? If we can get from A to B, so I need a car. That's my B, right? I need a car. And I'm at A, I don't have a car. So what ways can I get a car? Well, I can go buy a car. I could borrow someone's car. I could just say, hey, can I borrow your car? I could steal a car, right? Or I could, go rob a bank and then buy the car for that money. I mean, all these ways get me from A to B. But how many of them are really okay? Well, really, only the legal ones are probably okay. So this is a quote from Jeremy Hammond, which we'll talk about him throughout the presentation. He's a, activist, hacktivist, whatever you want to call him. And this was a quote that he gave at DEF CON 12 prior to the Republican National Convention. He said, any method of disruption at any cost, any means necessary. So I think it's safe to say that his sort of thing is, the ends justify the means, right? To get from A to B, we can do whatever we need to do to get there. So let's talk first about the First Amendment, free speech. I'm not going to read it to you. You've seen it before. Free speech. Let's be clear that when we're talking about free speech, the First Amendment applies to the government. So if I prevent you from speaking, that's not an infringement of your free speech because I'm not the government. However, that sort of, the idea here is we're talking about free expression, free expression of ideas. So we saw this quote on the second slide. Under certain circumstances, DDoS is protected political speech and should be afforded First Amendment protection. This is Jay Lederman, who is an attorney, and he was on the anonymous panel at DEFCON 20. And not surprising that he would make this statement because some of his clients are people who were anonymous activists who participated in DDoS attacks. So obviously he's defending them, and that's his argument. So how many of you would generally agree with this statement? DDoS should be protected political speech. Maybe anybody? A couple. Okay, fair enough. I mean, it's certainly controversial. It's certainly controversial. So what about when we get to someone like the Jester, right? How many have heard of the Jester? Most of you, yeah? So does it matter? So if it's something we don't like, we can easily, if it's the Westboro Baptist, we can say like, oh, we don't really like them. What if it's something that's sort of, that we like or something good? Does it matter if the reason is a good one? Does it matter if the Jester is DDoSing or is DOSing, some, Arabic whatever site, that people consider him a patriot, or that he's on our side, or that the other side is outside the United States. So whatever he does is okay because he's not really preventing Americans from speaking. Fair enough question. Let me tell you what I think. You can decide to agree or disagree. Personally, I think that muzzling speech of others is never an acceptable use of the First Amendment, never. So, and I think that participating in distributed denial of service or denial of service is basically admitting that you fail in, the marketplace of ideas, So this comes down to, like I said, I think more freedom is almost always preferable to less freedom. So I think more speech is better than less speech. I think DDoS, so what is DDoS? I mean, how does that come to speech? I think this is like going to a protest, right? And you sort of do the whole Agent Smith thing on Neo. Remember at the interrogation where he closes his mouth and he can't talk? And he's like, I think that's basically what you're doing when you DDoS somebody. Personally, I think it's essentially censorship. So that means we can't say, well, this guy's doing it for a good reason, so it's okay. I think it's always a bad reason, personally. Okay, so we talked about the InfoSec disclosure debate, and we've been talking about that for a decade, longer, more than that, 20 years. Well, how about this one? There were 2 papers written on the H5N1 flu, and the National Science Advisory Board said, we don't really want to publish these papers because somebody might figure out the bad stuff you're talking about and do it on their own. Does it sound familiar? The board said this is an unprecedented recommendation, but we want to censor you. So think about this. This is an issue now this is sort of the backwards of what we're talking about here. This is an issue that we've dealt with many times. Now it's pushing out into public policy issues. A government advisory body basically said, we want to censor what you're going to publish. One of the studies eventually published later, they made some revisions to it, but think about that. So we talked about an analysis to the InfoSec disclosure debate. How about this? In February 2008, PayPal went to one of its people that use its services called Smash. Anybody hear of Smashwords before? Smashwords is like a way that you can publish your own books. There's many of these places out there, but you basically can publish your own stuff, really cheaply. And ebooks, by the way. And PayPal was the way that people used Smashwords. And PayPal said, well, if we don't really like the content of what's in these books, we're not gonna let you use PayPal. So PayPal was effectively censoring people's content. So it wasn't government censorship, but it is sort of legal censorship, right? We have to think about how does that promote self-censorship? If say I write on a provocative topic, and I know that PayPal is gonna say no to my book. First of all, they have nothing to do with the book itself. Is that gonna change how I write or what I write about because they may or may not publish it? So does it have a chilling effect on what people express their ideas? So there was a lot of pushback from the EFF and others, and they eventually revised their policy. Originally, their policy was just sort of obscene content. Well, what the hell does that mean? And they really wanted to focus on like child pornography, but their definition was so broad that it included a whole bunch of other things. And now we return to Jeremy Hammond. So if you want to see this speech in its entirety, it's pretty interesting. I'll give you the link later. It's on my YouTube page, so youtube.com/thepres98. It's called Electronic Civil Disobedience in the Republican National Convention. And I'll just give you a few brief highlights. He gave the quote that I talked about earlier, sort of all means necessary. He basically rambled on stage. There was a lot of booing and hissing. And at one point, halfway through the speech, you all know Priest, who's one of the head security goons at DEF CON, actually came onto the stage, interrupted the talk, and basically said, because Jeremy had been calling for like violent acts and things like this, and Priest basically interrupted the speech and said, no, we're not doing this. And then he later had to be sort of escorted off the stage because people were getting very mad and angry at some of the stuff he was saying. So that's our little sort of brief history of Jeremy Hammond. And we'll get back to him again because he shows up again. So we talked a little bit about free expression. Let's talk about privacy. You won't find the word privacy in the Constitution. It's not there. But we sort of have some privacy issues coming from the Fourth Amendment. So Fourth Amendment's up here. I highlight the word unreasonable because you will see that the word reasonable or unreasonable is written into like so many different laws, and it's the most litigated word in the English language. It just comes up, is this reasonable? Net neutrality all comes down to what's reasonable and what's not reasonable. So you will see that a lot. And again, Fourth Amendment has to do with privacy against government intrusion. If I come and knock down your door, you can't say that I violated your Fourth Amendment rights because I'm not the government. I violated your privacy, but not your Fourth Amendment. So the whole concept of the Fourth Amendment is the reasonable expectation of privacy. And it's a calculation, right? So there's two things, an actual expectation of privacy, and which is sort of what you think, and then the expectation is reasonable to other people. So it's kind of a circular reasoning, but let me give you an example. You go into a phone booth, and a public phone booth, and you close the door to the phone booth, which we don't really have those phone booths anymore, but we used to, and you sort of hold your hand over the mouth or the mouthpiece, and you talk. So the question would be, do you have a reasonable expectation of privacy in your communications? And the courts would say yes, because you closed the door, you lowered your voice, you covered your mouth. But if you were out in the middle of a park and screaming out loud, you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy, so that sort of thing. But the important point to see here is that these are variables. Both of these things are variables. If I publish your social security number on the internet, that's not free speech because it's your private information, right? And the more times that you see private information, it becomes less private and less private. So the argument here would talk about the costs and benefits of, for example, posting information about security breaches. So XYZ group breaks into Texas Sheriff Department website and posts all their addresses on the internet, right? So what are we talking about here? We're talking about releasing people's private information. When private information is not private anymore, then that changes the reasonable expectation of privacy. So the problem here is that the benefit might be, okay, we exposed this security flaw. The cost is that we're changing people's expectation of privacy. We're actually losing Fourth Amendment protection every time someone does this. So that's the cost. Is the benefit versus the cost worth it? I'm going to talk about this very briefly, but I want to expand on it in a follow-on talk. But I want to talk a little bit about civil forfeiture and why this is really something that is beginning to intrude on our community. So the concept of civil forfeiture is this really exploded in the 1980s in the drug wars, and this is basically seizing sort of the assets of people that are being used for drugs. So people's car, the boat, all this stuff, and then the government would just either use it or sell it. So the problem here is that the person who owns the thing, let's say you own a boat, right? And I'm the government, and I suspect that you're using the boat to traffic in drugs. So civil forfeiture, I actually sue the boat, not you. So this is sort of weird, right? So I sue the boat, and you're a third party, so you have sort of an interest in it, but you have to, now I can seize it with a court order, but then you have to prove that that boat was not being used in drugs. So you see what's wrong here? The presumption of innocence has completely flopped, and now you are required to prove something to get it back. So that's a little bit weird for our system of law, right? We expect a presumption of innocence. Well, this is sort of flipping it on its back. And so this is sort of how the government is doing domain takedowns. So the domain is property, right? It's not the same as a boat, but it's property. So the government can just go to the court and say, well, this domain's being used in, whatever, and they seize it, right? They're not really seizing the content, they're seizing the domain name. And you might be wondering to ask, well, what happens if this is some, sports site in Spain that shows the Super Bowl, right? Well, the problem is if it's a .com or a .net or a .org, all those registrars are located in the United States. So the property is in the United States. And then the last thing I want to talk about is, this is sort of what I want to talk about in one of my next talks, is about sort of Microsoft's botnet takedowns, where you run a small ass ISP, right? And you get a knock on the door, and it's not the US government, but it's Microsoft. And there might be a US Marshal with them, but it's Microsoft. The US Marshal's just there to help enforce a private civil action, and they're going to come into your ISP and take your servers, and what the hell is that all about, A procedure which even Microsoft says is constitutionally suspect. So, copyrights and patents. I'm not going to talk about DMCA, you all know that. There was a case in the Supreme Court this past session, Golan v. Holder, and I'm not going to go into it in detail other than to say that the Supreme Court in Golan v. Holder said that materials that have been released to the public domain, so public domain, can be later given copyright protection. Does that make any sense at all? No, but that's what they said. So there's a whole bunch of material that had been, copyright protection had ended. And then the United States signed an intellectual property treaty, and a lot of that stuff got put back into copyright protection. And people are like, whoa, what the heck? That doesn't make any sense. But that happened. And I'm not going to talk about patent trolls because it's sort of and it's just going on. Next topic, licensing laws. How many of you live in a state where you have to be licensed to be maybe a locksmith? So there's some out there. So let's talk about the purpose of licensing laws in the first place. Well, what is the purpose? Well, okay, in some of these cases, you might say, well, I want to make sure that the doctor that I'm going to is not a fraud, right? He's not some guy that went to some fake school and mailed in his diploma, and okay, so there might be some legitimate reasons for that. Well, what about so in Maryland, we have a pretty stringent law to be a private investigator. You have to work for someone else for 5 years to pay these exorbitant licensing fees. Well, why? Do they really want to make sure that the private investigator you're hiring is legitimate? Not really. The case is that in the 1950s, when the private investigator licensing laws were written, they were basically written by the private investigators to keep everyone out so they would have the business to themselves. So they created a high barrier of entry for everyone else. So we talked about doctors, maybe lawyers. I mean, there's certainly some instances where licensing laws are good. But what about, really a masseuse? A lot of states require like 500 hours to be a masseuse. Okay, I mean, maybe there's a good reason for it, but we have to think about licensing laws. Why are they there? If they're there just to keep other people out so that the people who are already doing it can profit and not have to worry about competition, then maybe that's not such a good idea. So I want to talk about sort of the current world, the way that we sort of look at things, not just me, but the way that we as society look at issues and maybe turn it on its head. So our current worldview is sort of this. We've got this massive government, right? Regardless of your view on government, but the government is massive. We spend massive amounts of money, and we kind of say that, okay, everything's out there, and we have little islands here and there where we have things we can do. Free speech, that's over here. Fourth Amendment, privacy, that's over here. And, whatever. We have all these little islands, and as long as we're on one of those islands, we're okay, but let's try to stay out of the rest of the sea. So I asked this question before in a previous talk. Do you have the right to wear a red hat on Wednesday? Well, you can look in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and you're not going to see anything about hats, right? Nothing about Wednesdays, nothing about, so should you be able to wear a red hat on Wednesdays, right? I mean, we can argue whether or not it's sort of free expression, whether it falls under free speech, but there's nothing in the Constitution about free speech or about red hats. I would argue that sort of when we ask the question this way, it's fundamentally the wrong way of asking the question, right? And I'll get to the answer on the next slide. And this next point is we're going to talk about, just for the sake of this example, the Obamacare. So the Supreme Court said that Obamacare, the individual mandate, was not constitutional under the Commerce Clause. Okay, however, if we consider it to be a tax, it is constitutional. Okay, so not going to get into that other than just say sort of the way we look at issues is that if a law can be found to be constitutional, even if it's not the way that the writers intended, then we'll say it's constitutional. So the president said it's not a tax, the Congress said it's not a tax, they specifically said it's not a tax. But the court said, well, if we look at it like a tax, it's okay. So that's how the courts operate. If you can figure out a way to make it constitutional, even if it's not the way they wanted, then it's okay. That's just the way that the courts work now. And that wasn't supposed to happen. So I think we need to take all of that and flip it on its head, right? So it shouldn't necessarily be, well, we're on this island here, so we have free speech. We're here, let's flip it. Let's say that, well, what about, let's ask the question differently. Should it really be, can I wear a red hat on Wednesdays, or should it be, can the government prevent me from wearing a red hat on Wednesdays? And clearly, there's nothing in the Constitution that allows the government to do that, right? So flip the question, shift the burden from the person to prove the issue to the government. So the presumption here is not that anything's constitutional. The presumption is liberty. So anything that restricts that ought to be proven by someone else, not me. So this is sort of a healthy skepticism, right? Some questions that you think about regarding any law. Does the law actually accomplish what it's intended to do, right? Is it a short-term solution or a long-term solution? We're really good at these things right now. We're really good at good intentions, right? We're really good at good intentions. We're good at short-term solutions. We're good at solutions that benefit this little group over here and may not screw everybody else, but sort of it helps this group. And we're good at making good things happen for X, Y, or Z, but not A, B, or C. So think about these questions when you see an issue. we can, and this quote on the bottom sort of exemplifies this. We really ought to think about, when we're going to judge whether a law is good or not, think about not the intentions, because the intentions don't really matter. The results are the only thing that really matters. Okay, I'm not going to read this. Anybody from Massachusetts? Anybody? No? Not at all? Okay, there's a Senate candidate in Massachusetts named Elizabeth Warren, and she gave this speech about sort of a justification for taxation and fair taxation. I'm not going to go into, I don't really care about the policy implications of it, except at the end, she said this: part of the underlying social contract is that you take a hunk of that and pay it forward for the next kid who comes along. So we're going to talk about social contract very briefly. Talk a little bit about some philosophical issues. What is a social contract, right? How many of you signed a social contract with the government? Anybody in the room? I don't think so. So 56 people signed a social contract, and those people were all dead, but they signed the Declaration of Independence, which was sort of a social contract. A social contract is an agreement between you and the government that basically says, I'm going to give up some of my rights to the government to give you the authority to be in charge to protect my rights. That's what a social contract is. However, we need to be, none of us signed that, right? So it's sort of like assumed. We need to be very careful about when we talk about what people's obligations are under social contract theory, because there's a whole bunch of different things you could say are in the social contract. But again, none of us actually signed anything. These next issues, I want to talk a little bit about government power. So let's assume, for the sake of this presentation, we all agree that anything that's in this box is something the government can do. We agree that the government can do it. Now, we could also say there's things that are outside that, we can argue about where the boundaries is, but let's assume we have this. So right now, we basically stop at this point. If it's in the box, it's okay. If it's outside the box, it's not okay. And sometimes we don't even go that far. But this is sort of the most elementary level that we get to. However, we need to be better than that, right? So we know that the Constitution, the way that the Constitution is set up, we have 3 levels of government: federal, state, local. We need to be careful about what happens if the federal government does something that the states are supposed to do, or what happens if the states do something that the federal government's supposed to do. We can have the greatest law, but if it violates one of these federalism issues, then we need to be willing to say no. But we need to go even one step further. We know that the Constitution prescribes the separation of powers: legislative, executive, judicial branch. If the legislature tries to do something that the executive branch is supposed to do, even if it's a good idea, we ought to say no. If the executive branch, and here's a great example, the FCC, which is an executive agency, rolled out net neutrality rules, which it did not have authority to do from Congress. They were acting outside of their box of power. So we ought to, even if we think net neutrality is a good idea, we ought to say, you got to do it the right way. So we talked about, sort of throughout this talk, about process. It's important about how we get from A to B. The process is more important than the substance. And you may say, well, okay, I looked at it the way you did, and I came out to a different conclusion. Absolutely fine. No reason. I don't care what your B is. As long as we start looking at issues this way, I think it's a better way. So, illegal activism, right? Let's be clear. So we talked about Jeremy Hammond, right? So let's talk about costs and benefits. What are the benefits of things that Jeremy Hammond has done? Well, it's hard to measure, but he's been out there doing activist stuff, What are the costs? Well, in the past 10 years, Jeremy Hammond's been arrested at least a dozen times. He spent 18 months in federal prison. He's currently in prison for, I don't know if it was the Stratfor, one of the recent hacks. He was turned in by this guy, Cebu, who was also apprehended by the FBI, and then they turned him to go against other people. So, and most people believe he turned because of his relationship with his daughter. He didn't want to go to jail because he's got a daughter. So the costs are mounting here, right? You're putting your personal liberty at stake for something. some other lulsec guy. All these, there's so many more, but these are just a few examples of some of the people that have been arrested and or charged with DDoS or other attacks. And this guy on the bottom, one of these guys almost looks like Dave Marcus, but I have it on good authority that's not actually Dave Marcus. The one on like the second to bottom row, the third one, I mean, it sort of looks like him a little bit, but it's not. I promise it's not. So these are just some of the people that have been arrested. So these are costs, right? These people are going to prison, or at least going to be charged. They're going to have to hire lawyers like Lederman, and they're going to have to figure out, you know, whether or not the benefits of what they did, you know, DDoSing PayPal or whatever, was a good idea, and whether the price they paid was worth it. And we have to think about what is the benefit of what they've done, and what's the cost of it. They're paying a personal cost. They're going to jail. Well, what about our costs? Are there costs on us? And I would say yes. I would say that when they do something, well, somebody in Congress says, well, we need to pass a law to prevent them from doing this, this, and this. The law becomes tougher. We can argue about whether or not the penalties for these crimes are worth it or not, and sometimes they may be excessive, but that's what it is. And so think about that. There's a very high social cost to what all these people are doing. And there might be a benefit too, but there's a very high cost. Of course, they're all innocent until proven guilty. If you ever learned anything from watching Cops, that's true. Except if it's a civil forfeiture, then you're not innocent. So let's go to sort of working within the system, legal methods. Well, we saw with Google and Wikipedia and the sort of SOPA and PIPA thing, where the whole community sort of said, you know what, no, no, we're not going to do this. So a really good example of where working mostly within the system, and there are people working outside the system, but I would say working mostly within the system worked. How many have heard of TestPack? Anybody? So TestPack was set up on Reddit, and there's a bunch of people who were decided that they want to set up a political action committee to talk about or to sort of donate money to candidates who they supported. Well, TestPack's opponent was Lamar Smith, who's a Republican from Texas, who was one of the authors, I think, of one of the cybersecurity bills. I don't know if it was SOPA, one of these bills. And they collected money, $7,000 or something like that, and they put up a billboard, and well, it didn't turn out so well. So Lamar Smith's district is very Republican. They were sort of going after his opponents in the primary, or supporting his opponents in the primary. You know, entrenched Republican district, more or less just threw their money at a wasted cause. You know, not to say that it wasn't a good idea, but you have to pick the right fights, right? And they didn't pick a very good fight. So just working with the system doesn't always mean it's a good idea or that it works out. You know, this is a case where it didn't work out the way they wanted. Hopefully the next step they do will be something better. This is a smart meter. We have in Maryland, about a year ago, the sort of prevailing view in Maryland was that when they come to your house, they're going to install a smart meter, and there's nothing you can do about it. So myself and a few other people, some people who were maybe a little bit on the fringe in terms of their views, said, you know what, we would like at least an option to say no. I don't want the smart meter. And for those of you who do live in Maryland or other states that do this too, so say there's a bill to do something, XYZ. So a legislator in Maryland wrote a bill that said the utility companies should allow people to opt out, to basically just say, I don't want a meter. Well, in Maryland, you can just go to the state legislature when the day that they're going to discuss the bill, and you sign your name on the piece of paper, and they let you speak, like in front of the committee who's going to vote on the bill. It's really cool. So I went and did that, and there was a whole bunch of other people who did that, and the committee voted 23-0 against us. So we were like, okay, whatever. However, the Maryland Public Service Commission, about a few months ago, you know what, said, no, that's a good idea. And now the rule in Maryland is that you can tell the BGE or the utility company, no, I don't want a smart meter, and they can't put it on your house. So we do have the option now. So I didn't have to DDoS anybody to do that, right? I mean, I actually worked, it wasn't just me, it was other people too, but we worked within the system and we said, we gave ourselves an option. So just an example. Sometimes things work out the way we want, sometimes they don't. So what things can we do? We always say this, vote, go vote, right? Well, you know, sometimes a lot of people just don't vote. There are cases, especially in local elections, where issues come down to, you know, a handful of votes. And honestly, whether Romney or Obama wins is probably less relevant to your everyday life than who your city councilman is, or who your town, you know, councilor is, or those really local elections, because those are the people who are going to mess with your everyday life. Whether we have Romney or Obama, we can argue about that, but I think the local elections are really important to you. And then you say, oh, I don't really like the choices, right? I don't want to vote for Romney or Obama. Well, it's a little late to run for president, but maybe for some of these local elections, maybe it ought to be you. Why not? Why can't you be the candidate? There's a lot of things you can do. Participate online, write letters, testify like I did, speak out. You can even occupy if you want. I don't care. As long as you're doing it legally, go for it. You know, Todd didn't talk about Occupy really at all in this presentation, but to the extent that they're operating within the law, hey, go for it. Putting up tents, maybe, you know, crossing the line, but, you know. So educate yourself. There's a lot of bad news out there, right? If the only source you get your news from is Fox News, or on the other side, if the only news you get your news from is MSNBC, you're doing it wrong. Really, you are, okay? That's not to say that Fox News doesn't do some good journalism, or that MSNBC doesn't do some good journalism, but really, broaden the scope of what you're looking at, right? I like to read articles from 3 or 4 different sources that are on the same issue and look at how they work. Identify good sources and bad sources. Any of you are familiar with RT, like RT.com, used to be Russia Today? This is the only sort of source that I'll talk about. They're terrible. Their headlines are sort of link bait, and they don't actually talk about those things in the articles, and their analysis of stuff is really bad. So don't rely on other people to tell you what's in the bill or what's in the law. Go read it for yourself, right? So there's this site called Open Congress. There's a whole bunch of sites that have legislation out there, right? But Open Congress allows you to go, like, mouse over an individual section of the law, and you can comment on it and see what other people are saying about it. So this is a section of the National Defense Authorization Act that talked about indefinite detention. This was really controversial when it passed. And I went to this Open Congress site, and I was the only person who made a comment on it. Like, no one else had even said anything. And I basically said this part of the law was found unconstitutional. Like, really important, but people aren't even, oh, they just say they don't care about it. But go read what it says and see what other people are saying, and, you know, educate yourself. Don't rely on what someone else says, even me. 5 minutes. So what else can you do? You got to educate other people that what they're doing is their rights or your rights, and vice versa, right? So let's go to a real controversial one. Westboro Baptist Church. Westboro Baptist Church is, from a legal standpoint, they're very smart. They have legally educated people working for them, and they push the limit of the law, but they only go right to the limit. They don't go over it, right? There was a case that went to the Supreme Court 2 years ago, and the Supreme Court said, you know what, they're allowed to protest at funerals as long as they're a certain distance away and whatever, you know. What they're doing may be absolutely reprehensible. We disagree with it, you know, everything they say. However, they're doing it within the law. We need to be able to stand up and say, as much as I hate the Westboro Baptist Church, their free speech is as important as mine, because if you take theirs away, they're not going to be there to protect yours, right? Their right is our right. It's the same thing. Controversial, but that's where I come down. The video, so 2 videos that I talked about, the Jeremy Hammond video and the anonymous panel at DEF CON. I have them both on my YouTube, so youtube.com/thepres98. These slides will be at, they're not there now, but they will be, scribe.com, thepres98. There's my Twitter, thepres98. And that's all I've got for you. Thank you. Got about 3 minutes for questions, if anybody has any questions.
You focused on all the activists talking about different activists called DDoS. But you didn't notice or mention the fact that they go over other laws, and that's what they're actually charged. They're not being charged with DDoS.
Sure. Well, I mean,
Laws and release information.
sure, but it depends on the case. So there are certain circumstances where DDoS can be charged under a Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is damaging computers. So just the act of DDoS, I mean, there's no DDoS law, but that's what you're right. They're being charged under Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986. You know, in 1986, we didn't really know what a DDoS was, so we couldn't write it into the law. So therein lies one of the issues. These laws need to be updated. And some 70-year-old judge, what does he really know about DDoS? He might not know. So he's really relying on what the government says. The government says they damaged a computer, and maybe they did damage a computer. But you know, I'm not saying that all these issues are black and white, because they are certainly not. However, you know, as the law is currently written and as it's interpreted, if you do that, you're going to get arrested. You potentially get arrested.
You did a great job, but I think that you're missing the point, like gender supporters versus anonymous supporters. It's the Robin Hood factor. Most of those people know what they're doing is bad. Like,
sure.
Like, you talk to desperate people, they're like, yeah, I know what he's doing is bad, but I'm going to support him anyway. And it's kind of up to them to make sure that you know that the sheriff of Nottingham Forest doesn't catch them.
Sure.
So, I mean, I think that everybody knows. I think there are very few people who, except for like the really stupid ones that you showed on the anonymous slide at the bottom section, that don't know that what they're doing
Sure.
is legal. They're just trying to help.
Yeah. Well, and I think I would agree with that, and I would think even many of those people know it. I mean, Jeremy Hammond certainly knows what he's doing is illegal, right? He's been arrested enough times to figure that out. I hope. You know, so it's just a matter of, you know. But yeah, it's a good point.
I think you spoke about getting involved in elections at the local level. A lot of us in Texas have actually got involved with local parties. And what we learned is that you know, the A's, when the religious right helped take away the Republican Party, we basically adopted their same tactics and tried to change the party from the inside. And I think one of the things that the recent convention showed is that taking control of the Texas political party doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have much of an impact at the national level.
Right.
They actively work against you having a voice in that.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's certainly not easy to do. You know, it's an uphill battle, but it doesn't mean it can't be done either, or that we shouldn't fight the fight. But
We're definitely involved at the state level. I mean, you know, it's once we try to move to the national level, they say, all right, you're not letting the big boys.
right, absolutely, that's a good point. Anybody else? Yeah.
I so you're defining DDoS as one person not an entire group of people.
Or it could be that too. It could be like
So
the.
you have a group of 1,000 people all objecting to a particular company, so they send an email. Does that become a DDoS?
I don't think. I think intent has a lot to do with it, right? I don't know. I don't think sending an email as part of. No, I wouldn't. I mean, it may be considered that, but I'm talking about like using a DDoS tool where you're allowing your computer to be used as an attacker. But you raise a good point. All right, thank you.